Well, brothers and sisters, it's wonderful to be with you. I have a number of friends here and people from my stake, the Ensign stake. I'm a member of the 18th North Ward of the Ensign stake. And Brother Rice, where are you? There's Brother Vern Rice, who is our stake patriarch. I have many of my close friends and family members here. Jim McConkey and Brent were responsible back in 1981 for getting me from Ventura, California, me and my family, here to Salt Lake City. And so I'm most grateful for these two good brethren who are also two of my dearest friends. And Mary Ellen Elgren and John and Marcy Brown, close family members in the Brigham Young Family Association. And so I just met a few of you recently. Just grateful to be among such wonderful people. I have been told that my colleague at the Ensign Peak Foundation, Kim Wilson, was here. Is that right? Recently? And I'm going to have to take off my coat. I'm a little probably nervous and hot. And Kim told you something of the work of our foundation, and that's been a joy over the years. I think, as Kim may have mentioned to you, the Ensign Peak Foundation was one of the major contributors in the restoration of Kirtland. We were able to raise, I think it was almost $5 million to change the roads and to do some of the other infrastructure work there that was able or made possible the historic Kirtland restoration. And now, was it a week ago, last Tuesday, that we learned that the church has purchased the Kirtland Temple, the other different real estate in Kirtland, that they have purchased Joseph Smith's log home, which is by the Mississippi River, and which Joseph and Emma lived in for a lengthy period of time, the mansion house where Joseph lived until the time of his death, where his body and Hiram's lay in state. The Nauvoo house is now in our possession. The actual Bible that Joseph Smith purchased so that he could fulfill the Lord's direction to go through the Old and New Testament and do an inspired revision with his notes in the margin. And that is now with us. And a few years ago, as you may know, the church, for I think $30 million, bought the publisher's transcript of the Book of Mormon. That's the transcript that Oliver Cowdery hand copied from the original manuscript that he had written as the words of Scripture, words of revelation, came from the prophet Joseph's mouth primarily in Harmony, Pennsylvania. We received that a few years ago, along with Joseph and Emma's Kirtland home, and also Hans Mill we received back then, and also about 3,000 acres in Independence, Missouri. A lot of people are unaware of that. So many of the first documents. Oh, and I forgot John Whitmer's original history of the church. And this is particularly significant to me because my great-great-grandfather, who was a person by the name of Ezra T. Clark, who joined the church in Illinois and went to Missouri with his family as a young man and came to Nauvoo as a young man of about 18 years of age, then came west and settled and became a prominent citizen in Farmington, Utah. Ezra T. Clark wrote a long statement of testimony to his children to be read by succeeding generations, he asked, at a family reunion. And that is still happening today. And Ezra T. Clark said, I was present when the prophet Joseph spoke and gave several keys by which we would always know where the true church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was. And one was where the majority of the saints were associated, the bulk of the people. And then one of the other keys was that the true church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints would have the records of the church. Well, we had most of the records of the church, all along, but there were some key records of the church that we didn't have. And John Whitmer's history, that document, and the printer's manuscript, and some of these others, and we now have those. And so you and I have lived to see the fulfillment of prophecy and the fulfillment of the prophet Joseph's keys on how we may know that we are in the true church of Jesus Christ. So anyway, it's a really exciting time. I know I was talking to Don Savage here. Don, you're planning maybe to go back to Kirtland for your how many time? Upteenth time? Pardon me?
Yes.
Yes. Don goes back like every 4 years, if not more, to these key restoration sites, and often with his family. And there is a Mormon History Association meeting back there in Kirtland early June. And Don had an interesting thought that the Latter-day Saint missionaries are going to begin to proselyte or to give tours in the Kirtland Temple. When, Don?
Monday, March 25th is when the Kirtland Temple will reopen, just in 2 weeks, under Latter-day Saint control.
With our missionaries. And Don thinks there is a possibility that sometime close to that, maybe 2 days later on the 27th, which is the anniversary of the Kirtland Temple dedication, that someone will be there to rededicate the Kirtland Temple to the current working of the Lord. Certainly, I don't think the missionaries are going to be operating in that space unless it is dedicated. That would be my thought. So what a really exciting time that we're living in. And one of the questions I have, brothers and sisters, do our children understand the significance of these sites? Do our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren know what the Kirtland Temple means? Do they understand what took place in the Kirtland Temple that directs our lives today in missionary work, in temple work, in the gathering of Israel in every way? Do they understand that? And I was talking to a friend recently And almost all of us here, now there's some young, this brother here who led us in the Pledge of Allegiance is of a different generation. And there may be some others that I'm missing here. There are some. But when I grew up, I rubbed shoulders regularly with family members, including my mom and dad, who had close contact with those who lived in the earliest days of the church and who met and mingled with the prophet Joseph Smith. My great-great-grandmother Lambert was, I think, when she passed away, my dad was 10 or 11 years old or 9 years old and had frequent contact with her. She was a convert of Parley P. Pratt in Liverpool, England, with her family, the Cannons. And then she moved to Nauvoo when she was 14. And she leaves her testimony that when, I think it was the Maid of Iowa, came up the Mississippi and docked in Nauvoo, there were a group of men to welcome them and others on the dock in Nauvoo. And as she looked down on the men, she immediately knew who the prophet Joseph Smith was, though she had never seen him or a picture of him. And then she met him and shook hands with him. And she said, during that experience, a testimony was born upon my soul that I was in the presence of a prophet of God that never left me. And she died in 1914. So, and they were, and you had the same experience. So we grew up in that atmosphere, in that milieu, I would say. Mary Ellen, your great-grandmother, and we still have a cousin who was another generation closer, walked across the plains. And she lived until when?
Well, I was 13 when she died, so.
So here's Mary Ellen, who had an ancestor who walked across the plains. And how old were you?
I was 13.
13 when she passed away. So, that's been the tradition of the sons of the Utah Pioneers and the daughters of the Utah Pioneers, these great and wonderful organizations. The question to me is, because it's a question that I ask myself almost every day, do my children, do my grandchildren have the same blessing of being exposed to the stories, to the sites, to the biographies and autobiographies of my ancestors as I was? And not just my ancestors, but when we're Latter-day Saints, all of those great Latter-day Saints that laid the foundation of this work are like family. I remember when Jim and I were in the mission field, we were in England, we both read the autobiography of Parley P. Pratt. And I felt as close to Parley as I did to any of my ancestors. I felt he was a spiritual ancestor and that I was part of the heritage of Parley P. Pratt. So that's one question that I would ask. And what can organizations like the SUP and the DUP do to make sure that these stories are carried on to another generation? Wouldn't it be fantastic if every evening or if every Saturday or whenever the DUP and SUP are open, that there are young people in there in those magnificent libraries taking down biographies and reading them and learning about our history, which in my view is as glorious, if not much more so, than the first century members of the Church of Jesus Christ experienced in their lives, who had the acquaintance of Paul and of Peter. I think we, in our dispensation, have been even more thoroughly blessed. So that's one question I would throw out to us all, and I'm thinking about it. The second thing is that, brothers and sisters, I dare say that in this group here, that we have been blessed with what Paul talks about. I think it's in Hebrews 12:1. Jim asked me if I was going to refer to the New Testament today. And there we are, James. 12:1, where Paul says, having had, speaking to the members of the church, having had such a great cloud of witnesses. I was once in the presence, I think, of Elder Holland. I'm trying to remember the exact place because he was a member of my ward for a long time, and I've been in his presence quite a number of times. But someone asked him something like, have you seen miracles or answers to your prayers? And he said, yes, hundreds of times, 10,000 times. And I don't doubt it. I have seen in my ward, when he was a member, miracles taking place in the lives of other members of the ward in their interactions with Elder Holland. Now, brothers and sisters, we've had many, many experiences ourselves. And my question is, are our experiences being communicated effectively to our children and to our children's children? And if so, how? And Jim, would you just stand up for a second? Come up with me here for a moment.
I didn't count on this today. I'm just here to take notes, Richard.
But Jim and I were talking about this, and he told me about his family home evening, just this 2 weeks ago or a week ago. Can you explain what you said or what happened in that home evening?
And what the specific reference to what, Richard?
Well, asking for testimony and then sharing your own testimony. Yeah.
In our family, it's always been traditional to have an extended family home evening. That's not unusual. In a group like this, extended family home evenings are not unusual. But we always had one in the McConkie household from the time I was a young man, and going back to 10, 11, and 12 through my college days. We'd meet with the entire family, and I heard over my lifetime about the experiences and the spiritual happenings of members of my family. And it was a natural environment where we shared those kinds of things. And I was concerned because as we continue in that tradition, I was concerned that those testimonies, those dreams and day visions and night visions that occur in families, that the kids understand the reality of those kinds of experiences so that they can have them themselves. And I've mentioned this to Richard. I've noticed that when people come back off of their missions these days, they don't seem to refer to as many spiritual experiences as Richard and I and Larry and other friends were aware of when we had our homecomings. And the gifts of the Spirit seem to have been, in a way, diminished when missionaries speak. And they are of a different kind and character sometimes, not always. But carrying on the spiritual tradition of the family involves making those kinds of experiences known so that you can be cross-examined. and help them understand the reality of those kinds of experiences.
And Jim told me that one of the things that he did in this last home evening is first ask, I think, a return missionary, family member, grandchild, to share with the larger family a spiritual experience they had had on their mission. And then it kind of turned into a bit of a testimony meeting. You ask your son Bryant if he would share a spiritual experience from his life. And then you can bear and share a spiritual experience from your life or from the life of an ancestor. And so that, and this can happen, once a month. If you have a gathering like that, or once every other month, or in some kind of a regular way, so that when our children think of us in our lives, they think of not only going to the BYU basketball game or, sunning on the beaches of Hawaii or Newport or things like that, which are all wonderful experiences, but they will think of grandfather and grandmother and their testimonies of the gospel and their experiences. Now, a meeting like that is one way. Let me just suggest another. I'm a great-great-grandson of Wilford Woodruff and a great-grandson of of Brigham Young, and a great-grandson of Wilford Woodruff. And growing up in my home, I heard about both of these great men and encouraged to read their experiences. Unfortunately, there weren't many of Brigham Young's experiences. I could, leading the saints across the plains, I had all of that. But Brigham didn't keep much of a diary throughout his life. He did keep some journal, and those are being published now, thankfully. And we're hoping to compile stories of incidents from his life, because his life was filled with them. But he was a man of action, and he was so busy leading the saints, I don't think he had much time to sit down and write. In fact, interestingly enough, from the tabernacle, he talked about the great missionary work of his friend Heber C. Kimball. And he said, once when I was in England with Brother Kimball and Brother Woodruff, I went down to London to visit them. And he said, I went into their lodgings and there were some, investigators standing by. And Heber just kind of surrounded them, with love and with interest, and was just such an effective missionary. He said, I looked off into the corner and there was Brother Woodruff writing in a diary. And he kind of said, that isn't the most effective way to do missionary work. What Brigham didn't understand is that Wilford Woodruff had been doing this since the day he joined the church, and took down so many of the words of the prophet Joseph and of Brigham that Wilford Woodruff was preserving and giving context to the entire history of the Latter-day Saints through his life. But anyway, Wilford had that, that compulsion, and it was a great one. Well, I have 2 sets of all of his journals, and they stretch out like this, and thousands upon thousands of words and pages. I think Brent has read through every one of the volumes. I haven't been able to do that yet. But in his old age, about the age of most of us, Wilford Woodruff sat down and said, I want to give just some of the most memorable spiritual experiences of my life. And he called it Leaves from My Journal. Now, some of you may be fabulous journal keepers. I'm not one of them, unfortunately. but I have written down some of the, choice experiences of my life, and I continue to do so. But Wilford did it and published it. And you can read this in a day. And it's so inspiring. From the time before he joined the church to almost the time of his death, is in this wonderful little book, Leaves from My Journal. And I've tried to encourage others to do the same. I've tried to encourage my friend Jim, who's kept a journal since your mission days. A friend of mine, Paul Warner, who I served with in the U.S. Attorney's Office, recently, in the spirit of that movie, The 27 Miracles, he wrote for a Christmas gift to all of his children and grandchildren 27 miracles in his life. He talks about, as many of us when we were kids, going in and hearing a phonograph record telling the story of miracles from Matthew Cowley or other great stories. And Paul said, when I serve as a missionary, boy, I would like to experience some of those same wonderful things. And Marcy's doing a video on Matthew Cowley and has talked to Paul. But he ended up being sent to one of the earlier missionaries to the Philippines. And he had those kind of experiences and he wrote them down, and many others when he was a bishop and so forth, 27 miracles. He said, I wanted to send this out. So if any of my children or grandchildren were tempted to leave the church over LGBT or over historical questions, which have always been the greatest, one of the greatest pillars of my own testimony is our history. And I've read all the other stuff too, but it usually almost completely out of context. But he said, I wanted my children and grandchildren to have to overcome this hurdle if they were just going to say this, I don't believe. Well, then how do you square that with Grandpa Warner's experiences? Is he lying? No, he's a pretty honest, frank guy. Maybe I ought to think again. So that's another way to do it. Two of my other friends have done the same thing, and these are just personal family. It's not for general publication. Here is one that my friend Carl Anderson of Kirtland, who wrote Joseph Smith's Kirtland and The Savior in Kirtland, 40 miracles in the life of Carl and Joyce Anderson. Quoting D&C 35:8, for I am God and I will show miracles, signs, and wonders unto all those who believe on my name. And another friend, my bishop, Paul Oscarson, as we talked about doing these same things, produced this. He called it, Paul Oscarson, Book of Remembrance, where he writes down the leaves from his journal, the cloud of witnesses, which he experienced in his life as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And finally, so I'd suggest maybe trying to do one of those things too. And now you can dictate them, or you can have a granddaughter put you in a booth down at, is it Riverton?
Riverton and Salt Lake.
And Salt Lake now, and you can have them question you on video, and you can tell them of your stories on videotape. And another way. The final thing I want to mention is going to the sites. And there are wonderful sites around us here, aren't there? We don't have to go to Kirtland, though it's wonderful to go there, or Palmyra. But right around us here are sites of great spiritual significance, which if we take our grandchildren or our children to and bear testimony to them while we're at those sites, or the testimony of our progenitors, will touch their hearts, and the testimony of the great work we're involved in will sink deep into their hearts. I just had my son called me a few months ago. It was October, and said, "Dad, we got some time in a week or 2 weeks to go and have you take us through all the Woodruff family sites and Young and the church history sites. We've got 4 days to do it. Are you up to that?" And he's got kids from 15 to 2 or 3 at the time in diapers. I said, "Well, son, if you're asking, I'll do it. We'll do it." And it was a wild 4 days in one of those big vans, high ceilings, and we fit 12 people or so, or excuse me, 9 people into it. But it was interesting, what stuck to people. We went in the woods to the birthplace of Wilford Woodruff. And at the end of our little trip, quick trip together, and we went from New York City to Cleveland, Ohio. I said to my 9 or 10-year-old grandson, I said, "Son, what touched you most?" And he said, "It was the feeling and the spirit I had when I was at Wilford Woodruff's birthplace." So you never know. And it may be your grandparents' farm out in Granger or someplace. But it provides an opportunity for us to bear testimony and to make our history come to life in the lives of our posterity. And Don, could you just bear your testimony of the effect that has had on your children? Could you stand up for a second?
I can, and I started thinking about some of the things that you've said. I can tell you one of the first church history site I went to in March of 1981. I was 25 or something, and I was on a business trip in Boston. I had the weekend off. I rented a car and I drove up to Sharon, Vermont. And it was before it's all been restored. And all there was the Hearthstone. And I can remember seeing that. And I can remember falling to my knees and gaining a testimony that Joseph Smith, a prophet of God, was born here. I can picture it. It's been imprinted in my mind. That was the first church history site out of Utah that I went to that I can remember. In 1992, 30 years ago, I took my son, 14 years old at that time, on a church history trip that was BYU playing Notre Dame for the first time in 1992, the first time. And the Cougar Club had arranged 2 buses, 80 people to meet in Independence. We toured Independence. We drove to Nauvoo. And I remember my son's eyes lighting up, and we stayed at the hotel in Nauvoo. And there were still pieces of the Nauvoo temple in the parking lot that were still evident with the sunstone and moonstone and pieces. And I know that made an impression on him, that he remembered that was real. As mentioned, my wife and I started in 2017 when we studied church history. We made 2 or 3 trips, went to all 60 church history sites. We did it again in 2021. We're doing it in 2025. Kirtland Temple, just talking about that a week ago in 2021. The week that we were studying the Kirtland Temple and Come Follow Me, we were there at the Kirtland Temple and we sat outside it and we read the scriptures and we read the dedicatory prayer, and the imprint was so strong and real and a forever impression. And I could talk for a long time. I'll just tell one more. I'll tell my favorite LDS joke that has a spiritual piece to it, okay? at my home, walking out the door, I have the Arnold Freiberg, how do you pronounce him? Freiberg, picture of Joseph kneeling in the sacred grove. I got it signed by him, a beautiful one, the trees. And my favorite joke I tell people as they're leaving is, who saw Joseph Smith praying in the sacred grove? Who saw Joseph Smith praying in the sacred grove? People say, who, what, Don? I said, well, the tree witnesses. And everybody laughs. But the reality is, I've been in the sacred grove. The reality is, every rock and leaf and tree is bearing witness that the Son and the Father and Son were there. That's why it's so strong at those sites, because the elements still bear testimony. They were witnesses. And so the tree witnesses do bear testimony, and that is a special site of many and all of them.
Thank you, Don. Just quickly along that line, I tried to take each of my children on a church history trip before their missions. I had one son who wasn't all that spiritually inclined. As we went to these different sites, he's reading Hot Rod magazine, and I try to steer things in a more spiritual way. But we get to the Sacred Grove, and this was early in the spring of whenever the year was. And we headed, from the Smith frame home down the path towards, where you kind of enter the grove. And when I got there, I said, son, I've got to use the restroom here. I'll catch up to you in the grove. And then, when I was ready to get back into the grove, I thought, or the impression came, don't go. Just wait a while. I waited about 25 minutes. And when I caught up or found my son in the grove, and I had asked him to maybe, or suggested he might want to say a prayer while I was in the grove. And he told me that he had. And he said, Dad, it really happened, didn't it? I said, it did, son. And so that's been a great blessing in his life. The other thing, finally, on this train of thought, in 1987, my wife's father, my father, these two grandfathers, and my oldest son, who was only 11 years old, took a trip to England and visited the church history sites in England. And to this day, I think my son would say it was one of the formative experiences of his life. Going with his grandfathers, it could have been his grandmothers, but to go with us, who they kind of revere, and as we revered our grandparents, and properly so, to have that time with a grandfather, with a grandmother, and to see these sites is a wonderful, wonderful treat. And you can do it, you can do it almost any time. A lot of them are so busy, but find a few days and say, hey, son or daughter, granddaughter, let's go to New York for an extended weekend. Or let's take a week over in England or whatever, and have this kind of experience with them. So those are the thoughts that I've had and want to bear testimony. In the final few minutes, I wanted to talk a little bit about great-grandpa Brigham Young. And as you know, Mary Ellen told me she was speaking to a group, where was it, in Ogden or somewhere, of temple sealers and their wives, and relayed what happened.
One of the wives came where I was.
Could you stand up?
preparing. And she said to me, well, what's your subject? And I said, Brigham Young. And she said, well, you don't like him, do you? And I said, well, in fact, I do. And even I love him. And later in the evening, she said, you know, I just have problems with him and Emma Smith. And I said, you're in the right place. We're going to talk about it.
And you know, the Lord said to Oliver Cowdery in D&C section 6:18, said to Oliver, stand by my servant Joseph and be with him in his difficulties and so forth. And you know, as long as Oliver did that, he was blessed. And when he decided that maybe Joseph was taking a little bit of a wrong turn or wasn't supporting him in the right way, he forgot about the Lord's direction to him, and it derailed him for a time. And I think whenever we become critical of our leaders, especially the Lord's prophet, we find ourselves on shaky ground spiritually. I'd like to read, do you know how, does anyone have an idea of how many sections of the Doctrine and Covenants mention Brigham Young? Just out of curiosity. 3. It's 3. It's the 124th section, the 137th section, and then the 126th section. And let me just read you the 126th section. This is given in July 9th, 1841 in Nauvoo, Illinois, in the house of Brigham Young. And Joseph Smith is in there. And this is the revelation. Dear and well-beloved brother, wouldn't you like the Lord or the Lord's prophet to speak that of you and me? Dear and well-beloved brother, Brigham Young, verily thus saith the Lord unto you, my servant Brigham, it is no more required at your hand to leave your family as in times past, for your offering is acceptable to me. Is that a wonderful thing? And maybe some of you have had that blessing of the Lord saying that to you in your own private inspiration. But to have the Lord say that in a public way, you know, I've seen your labors and your offering is acceptable unto me. And we could spend a whole time here talking about his offering. And then he says, I have seen your labor and toil in journeyings for my name. This is before he even crosses the Mississippi to come west. And then the third verse, I therefore command you to send my word abroad, to send it abroad, and take special care of your family from this time, henceforth, and forever. So I take it whatever Brigham is doing there today, taking care of his family here on earth is a part of that. Just a couple of things about this great servant of the Lord. When, you know, it took Brigham a long time to join the church. He had the Book of Mormon. He'd read it. He had talked to his brothers who had already accepted it. But it just took him a long time. He was 30 years old and he had had a lot of tough experiences in his life. And he was in some ways kind of a little bit, I think he was suffering from some depression. That's my sense. He wasn't buoyant as he later was in life. I think life had been tough for him, and he was in Mendon, New York, and had built this a mill over a little creek near his family in Mendon, and he had a wife that dying of tuberculosis, and he had a little girl, and then two little girls, and life was just terribly tough for him. And then he gets this message of the gospel. Well, the Lord was preparing him. This is from Heber C. Kimball. Upon one occasion, Father Young, Brigham Young, Joseph Young, and myself gathered together to get some wood. This is in Mendon, for Phineas Young, Brigham's brother. We were pondering upon those things which had been told us by the elders, and upon the saints gathering to Zion, and the glory of God shone upon us. And we saw the gathering of the saints to Zion, and the glory that would rest with them, and many more things connected with that great event, such as the sufferings and persecutions which would come upon the people of God, and the calamities and judgments which would come upon the world. These things caused such great joy to spring up in our bosoms that we hardly were able to contain ourselves, and we did shout aloud, Hosanna to God and the Lamb. Well, ultimately, about 6 months after Brigham was baptized in the spring of 1832, he and Joseph Young and Heber C. Kimball make it to Kirtland from Mendon. It was a long journey. And they knock on Father Smith's door, and he said, Joseph isn't here. He's out in the woods chopping wood. And so and I guess he points them to the wooded area to find Joseph, and they go out and they find the prophet Joseph. And I think Hiram is there, and Levi Hancock apparently was there, because Levi Hancock later said, when Joseph saw Brigham Young coming, he said to me, here comes one of the great men of the earth, who, if the world would be willing, he would lead them all to salvation. And then they meet they meet Joseph, and like so many, when they just shook his hand, Brigham said, I was perfectly satisfied that I had met the prophet of God, the leader of this great dispensation. And then they retired apparently to someone's house, and they had a little prayer meeting. And Joseph asked Brigham to kneel down and pray. And as Brigham is praying, he starts speaking in tongues, another tongue. And Joseph had never before heard the gift of tongues. And as soon as Brigham was done, the people jump up, and one of them, they came, Joseph, what was that? What do you make of that? And Joseph said, the Lord has let me know that it's a true spiritual gift of Brother Brigham that you have heard. And he said, it is of the pure Adamic language, the language that Adam and Eve spoke in the Garden of Eden, and which Enoch spoke. And then he said, if the Lord be willing, I will continue. And then Joseph started speaking in this beautiful language to the assembled folks there. And then he said, eventually, when the earth, receives its paradisiacal glory, this will be the language which we will be speaking. And then from other sources, that Brigham Young mentions it, that Brigham Young, or after he had left the area, Joseph said, Brother Brigham will one day preside over the church. So this is kind of where Brigham came from, and that was in Kirtland. Just one final Kirtland story. In the 136th section of the Doctrine and Covenants, I believe that's the section where Joseph, in his office at the top floor of the Kirtland Temple, on January the 21st of 1836, has a glorious vision in which he sees his brother, I got it right, let's see, 137th section, January 21st, 1836. He sees Alvin, his brother, he sees his parents who are still alive, and others entering the celestial kingdom and approaching the throne of our Heavenly Father and Jesus, his son, and being embraced in the glorious nature of that reunion. And of course, we take it, and he sees Alvin there, and Alvin never joined the church, and the Lord lets him know those who would have joined the church and been valiant, had they been able to tarry, or had they had the opportunity, will be inheritors of the celestial kingdom. And then he saw England. And then Joseph sees England, and he sees, and again, this is 1836, he sees the apostles in England, and the apostles having a really difficult time. And they're unaware of Jesus being there, but he sees Jesus in the midst of the apostles, and that they're in the care and the protection of the Savior. And then the final thing he sees is I saw Brigham Young standing in a strange land in the far south and west, in a desert place, in the midst of about a dozen men of color who appeared angry. Brother Brigham spoke to them in their own tongue. And that's what Joseph records in January 1836 in Kirtland, Ohio. Probably nothing could have been farther from his mind than the southwestern desert area of the United States of America. And for many years, we didn't know whether that had a literal fulfillment or not, but there was a witness, and it was your ancestor, right? Jesse Fox. Jesse Fox, your great-great-grandfather, was a witness to this and told others about his experience in Kanab. And so the editor of the Improvement Era sought out people who were still living. And among others was Caleb D. Britton and L.G. Harding, who lived at 1984 South 7th East here in Salt Lake, who were in Kanab when this event took place. And this was their affidavit. This is to certify that the undersigned, in connection with Jacob Hamlin and Ammon Tenney, were located at Kanab, Utah as missionaries when President Brigham Young, in connection with Jesse W. Fox Sr., visited the town. Black Hawk, an Indian chief, also some other chiefs, were camped near there. Black Hawk and his followers had been on the warpath for some time, and President Young was desirous of meeting him with a view of coming to some understanding as to a peaceful settling of the south part of the state. Jacob Hamlin, an Indian interpreter, was with the party, And while they were trying to parley, so for a period of time, or excuse me, trying to parley with the chiefs, President Young commenced to talk to them in their own tongue and continued to do so for a period of time estimated by me to be 20 or 30 minutes. The incident was quite a surprise to all of us, as we knew that President Young did not know their language. At the beginning of this talk, the Indians manifested considerable anger. However, at the conclusion of this parley, the Indians seemed to be appeased, for shortly after this incident, the Black Hawk War, as it was termed, ended. Witnessed L.G. Hardy and Caleb D. Britton, resident number 5, Bodell Apartments, 155 North Main Street, Salt Lake City, and L.G. Harding, 1984 South 7th East, Salt Lake City, Utah. And that was fulfillment of the prophecy given by the prophet Joseph in the Kirtland Temple. I think you've heard enough of me, and it's been a joy to be with you. I wish we had more time to hear what you've done with your families. I really would like to know. I'm struggling. We're going to have a big family reunion of all my kids and their kids and so forth in North Carolina in about 2 weeks. And they say they want to hear from Grandpa and Grandma. So what do I say? I don't want to make it too heavy or anything, but so I'd appreciate if any of you have some thoughts that you contact me and let me know. By the way, the Pioneer magazine came with this. Do any of you remember seeing this? This was the British mission issue, and it was 2010. And I was the chauffeur for the photographer Kenny Mays, who took all of these magnificent pictures. And this issue of the magazine is so rare that I think the mission presidents at the MTC in London have been passing this around and making copies of it so they could take their MTC Preston missionaries to these glorious sites that were made discoverable for the first time in your SUP magazine.
What did you do on that?
2010, volume 57, number 3. But boy, it's a great one. And then the final kind of a show and tell, and you can come and look at it. Be careful with it. It's the only one I have. This is a death mask taken from Brother Brigham by George Ottinger. You heard of Ottinger Hall, and it's up towards Memory Grove, and there's one up, but this is the place. But he took a plaster cast of Brigham's Young shortly after his death. He also took a plaster cast of his hand. I don't have that. But I'll leave this up here. You can examine it, and I'll pick it up if you'd be interested. You'll see he had a broken nose, kind of curves down, but I just like to bear you my testimony. I have had brothers and sisters like you, a cloud of witnesses in my life. The Lord has been so good to me and to my family. I know that He lives. I know that He answers our prayers. He is so real. And when we're on His errand, I found when we're stretching ourselves a bit, when we're inconveniencing ourselves just a bit, at least for me, that's when the Lord seems to be near us in our extremity. And I've had extremity, and the Lord has been near. And I love him, I love Jesus, his son. And I am so appreciative of the Holy Ghost and their testimony of the restoration. And I love the prophet Joseph. I love Brigham. I love Wilford. I love President Nelson. And I say this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.